We didn't have enough masks on that tour. We should have had masks for everybody. When somebody's wearing a mask, he's going to tell you the truth. Uh, when he's not wearing a mask, it's highly unlikely.
Hello again, everyone. It's Rigas again from the Practice Insights Research Agency, where, as our actual tagline suggests, every day we're looking at the best ways, new ways, the best ways to try and understand consumer consciousness at all levels, at the rational level, at the emotional level, even at the primal level. Today, we want to talk about how we move beyond the purely rational and how we conduct the business of tapping into the consumer subconscious and even down into the more primal drivers of the consumer. Now, tapping into the consumer subconscious is absolutely nothing new whatsoever. It's been around for a very long time, and I'm not an expert in the history of market research, to be honest, but I believe that some of the earliest inceptions of qualitative market research, because that was probably the first form of market research, was qualitative, that it was conducted probably more by psychologist types of people rather than sales or marketing types of people. We're talking a fair while ago now. And in fact, it was in marketing and in advertising after the war in the United States where Freudian ideas about the consumer subconscious and unconscious really flourished. In fact, they flourished in advertising and in marketing rather than in psychology itself. And that is purely because Freud, was I don't know if he was the first person, but I guess the first person to popularize the notion of a subconscious, but certainly one of the first medically trained people to propose this sort of thing, that there was in fact a subconscious component to human behavior and and even unconscious, and these unconscious forces, if you like, would drive people's current behavior as well. So that was the big revelation for marketing and advertising back then. And remember, it was a different environment back then for marketing and advertising. It was just taking off and TV was taking off. So this stuff meant a lot to them. The fact that there was this unconscious set of forces that, in particular, advertisers and marketers and salespeople could in fact play to, and did so seemingly rather successfully. Okay, so it's not a new thing to tap the consumer subconscious, but what we've got to the point now where we have systematized how it can actually be done. Moving down the track 100 years down the track and thousands of groups and interviews later, and a lot of training in the early years, we have managed to systematize the way that we can get down into the consumer subconscious through a variety of mechanisms. And that's what I want to illustrate to you today. What are these mechanisms and what levels are they allowing us to get into? And again, as usual, I'm not going to tell you how we do it, but I'm going to tell you about it as well, right? That's about it. It is one of our areas of expertise at the practice to get down into this area, and which is often very relevant for branding and advertising. And we often use these techniques in order to get to these particular areas of the human consciousness. So there are three that we want to talk about today. And one is called projection, the technique of projection. Another one is the technique of what we call the emotional coding. Some people call it cultural coding, but we call it the emotional coding. And then also the technique of the metaphor elicitation as well. Now, before we go into each of these three, I think it's important that we explain the underlying philosophy of these techniques and why we in fact even need them to get down into these areas, to get down into these areas of data from the consumer, the subconscious data, the unconscious data, the primal drivers. Why do we need these techniques? And the reason that we need these techniques is that unlike the rational brain, now, okay, let us backtrack here for a second. And we subscribe to very basically to the triune brain theory, and which is rational, emotional, primal. Brain is a lot more complicated than that and interrelated than that, obviously. However, for our purposes, this seems to suffice relatively well, this level of understanding. And it is basically coming from the Freudian level of understanding that there is a conscious and a subconscious and a primal, the id, the ego, the superego, all that sort of thing. And so we have developed various mechanisms to get here. And the reason that we just can't ask people about this is because it's not about the rational brain. Anything you want to know that comes from the rational brain, you can ask people direct questions and get direct answers. Okay, but in terms of this other stuff, you have to use different methods because the other parts of the brain, even though we express them in words, words are only part of the picture. Think about dreams, right? Think about dreams. Dreams seem to be full of metaphors and allegories and have symbolic meaning in the sense that what you are shown is not what it appears to be on face value, but perhaps symbolic of something else. And that is, in fact, how these parts of our brains perhaps communicate or maybe communicate to us. They communicate to us through images, through allegory, yes, through words. But again, those words are often mysterious and allegorical. They're not, the words themselves do not often mean what we remember them to mean in our dreams. Now, I'm not going to go into dream analysis, and I'm not sure I believe all of that stuff about dreams, but certainly the idea that we need to go beyond the words and beyond direct questioning to get to these levels of the consumer is a very important realization and aspect of this, because there is a tendency in our industry to shortcut, and we all try to do it. We all try to make the shortcut, but sometimes you have to go through all of these methodological motions and use these techniques in order to get the data, because shortcut is a shortcut, isn't it? A shortcut, you don't get to see everything in a shortcut. You are presupposing the answer. And this is all about not presupposing the answer, but about trying to understand. So these three areas, projection, metaphor, elicitation, and emotional coding, are all relying on the use of more images and memories and indirect questioning and so forth. So let's tackle each one at a time in order to illustrate how all of this basically works and why it is actually important. Let's go through each of these three. The first is projection. Have practiced a lot in this area. I've done so for projection, done stacks and stacks of projection. It's extremely effective. I try and use it wherever possible where we need to get below that. Even with political research, with voter research, we use that. It's very important to get to that level. Now, projection is all about the philosophy of give someone a mask and they will tell you all about themselves.
When someone is wearing a mask, he's going to tell you the truth. When he's not wearing a mask, it's highly unlikely.
And they will reveal stuff to you about themselves that they would not if they were not wearing a mask. If they can not be identified, they can tell you almost anything about themselves. Okay, and that is the point. Now, obviously, in consumer research, we're not asking people to reveal their dark family secrets to us. We're asking about their relationship with brands and products and advertising and this, that, and the other. But nevertheless, there are still certain elements even in those relationships that are subconscious, that we're only vaguely aware of, and we're also not really able to express, or we feel silly expressing them if it's coming just from us, right? So look, there are a number of different ways to conduct a projection. Probably one of the best ways to conduct a projection is by using faces of other people, not just one or two, but a whole range of them. Faces that look as though they've got different sort of personalities, maybe. This is a sort of a tried and true method. You need a bunch of these faces. But they can't be well known. They can't be anyone even vaguely well known or famous. They have to be completely anonymous people in these pictures, and because we are asking people to project through these other people. Right? So, which of these people likes X? Tell us about this person. What is it about this thing, the brand? And of course, if you don't know the person that you're projecting through, you have no choice but to tell us all about you and what you think. It's just that you're projecting through that particular person. I'm just an anonymous person. So the use of faces is tricky. The use of faces is tricky because everyone has different racial characteristics now in virtually all countries that conduct market research. You can't just show a set of white European faces, and that's probably a little bit ridiculous in this day and age in these countries, right? So it does become a little bit problematic in terms of who you choose and all that sort of stuff, which is why I'm saying, I don't know, choose many. It's qualitative. Okay, you're not running this through a quantitative thing. It's qualitative. Choose many, have a bunch of pictures, allow the respondent to choose one that they feel comfortable projecting through. And that's really all you need. That's really all that's necessary. It doesn't matter what picture they choose as long as they can project effectively through that picture to tell us some things that perhaps they might not say about themselves. Now, there is what's an example of this? There's so many examples. There is a classic example from the earlier days about cars and about BMW buyers, and it was long suspected that middle-aged men who spend a lot of money, if they can, of course, on a car are doing so not because they're buying better quality car, but because of some sort of need to prove their potency. It's like a midlife crisis thing, right? Need to prove their success and potency as individuals. This does not just apply to men, obviously, right? So the demonstration of status and power is something that is important to a lot of people, just regardless of your gender identification or whatever the case may be, right? But in the earlier days, we used to see it a lot more in men and in relation to expensive luxury cars. Now, here's the anecdote. The anecdote is that when you ask them why you bought a BMW, Mercedes Benz, whatever, they were the brands at the time. And they would say, I mean, it is a much higher quality car. The spec, the engineering lasts longer. It maintains its quality for a longer time than the Japanese car, which are a fair bit cheaper. Plus, of course, they are very well appointed internally. They are more luxurious internally. You get a bigger sense of a premium sense of luxury. Okay, fine, terrific. They are all accurate answers. These are all true. These are all true, but there's more. We would then get them to project. And of course, when they projected the person who bought the BMW, they would say that this person is in fact someone who, despite being, a family man and married and all that sort of thing, does like to appear, let's say, attractive to the opposite sex, and does this through this demonstration of wealth and power. That is one of the symbols of that is the motor vehicle as well. So everyone knows this, everyone suspected this was the case, but you've got to get the data, right? You've got to get the data. And this sort of stuff was pioneered, probably one of the pioneers of this sort of thing was this guy here, Ernest Dichter. And Ernest Dichter was a Freudian who became a very famous and enormously successful market researcher. We're talking 50s and 60s now, back in what we call the Mad Men era, was in fact a very successful, highly paid, highly revered market researcher who was in fact a Freudian, and he would debrief on all of this sort of stuff. And this was the age of branding, advertising, or it was the right time for this sort of thing. The other way that we can project, of course, is through the use of things. Look, a number of different images, but we like abstract images, and we like abstract images precisely because they're abstract. They don't have a literal meaning. They literally only have the meaning you give them. Of course, but you've got to use lots of different types of abstracts and make sure the abstracts have different moods and different feelings. You don't have to test them. It's qual, but you've got to have a variety of them there. You have to have a variety of them there in order for people to be able to choose the one that they can project through, the one that's close to how they feel. And that's the whole point about all this stuff. None of this stuff is about what they think. It's about what they feel. It's about what they feel. Which of these abstracts best reflects how you X, Y, Z? Okay, I'm not going to give away how we use them. And there's a whole bunch of probing and specific questions around those that projection allows us to get into the subconscious feelings, into the subconscious perceptions, into the subconscious motivations that are underlying a lot of categories. And some categories are a lot more subconsciously driven than others. There's no doubt about that, right? There's no doubt about that. But a lot of brands are subconsciously driven anyway, even in very simple categories. Even when often brand leaders have strong rooted cultural kind of nostalgia, emotional connections with their consumers. It's a function of time. They've been around a long time and used for a long time. But more important than that, they were around at certain crucial times for consumers. And that's where we want to go next. Emotional coding is a supremely interesting area. Now, I've not made this one up. I've not made any of this up. I've just been trained in this area, and I've pinched this technique, and I've done heaps of it as well, but I've pinched the actual technique of this guy here, a Frenchman. I think he's retired now. He still sends out the odd email here and there to his mailing list, but I think he's ostensibly retired. And why wouldn't he be? He made $1 squillion from doing this research in the United States and around the world. But yeah, good luck to him, because it's really brilliant, and he was brilliant. This is a very brilliant technique which he called cultural coding. What is the cultural code of a brand? He was very much attached to that thing about different cultures have different codes for different things. And he's kind of right. He's kind of right. But the whole thing about culture has broken down a little bit, as to be expected, as our communications increase and the world ostensibly becomes smaller. We break down the cultural barriers and hopefully we understand one another a little bit more. And it doesn't appear that way a lot of the time. But I think overall we do understand and appreciate one another's cultures a lot more than we used to, and everything's relative than we used to. But nevertheless, I like to call it emotional coding and not cultural coding for the very reason that I'm not sure about this cultural coding thing anymore. But emotional coding, that's definitely there right now. Emotional, because it's more individual, it's less social. I'm not a huge fan of sociology. I'm more of a psychology type person rather than a sociologist. But nevertheless, there is a social aspect to this as well. Now, emotional coding is really all about trying to understand at what point a brand was imprinted on the consumer and the nature of the imprinting as well, the nature of that imprinting as well. And this is really all about the imprint. Again, it's a very old psychological theory. So, imprinting, where were you? When were you? What were you doing? What was the nature of the imprinting? And he does this through memory analysis, but he has a particular technique that I totally pinched and ran it in a much more scale way. Of course, this is Australia, it's not the United States. We don't have that kind of money, but we ran it in a lot of it in a smaller scale way within more of a traditional focus group size. So I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of exactly what he did, but what he did was he basically collected data from qualitatively, but from quite large samples, face to face. In these big qualitative sessions, he would collect information on what people knew, and that was literally just downloading what people said and whatnot. He would then get them to make like collages, which he said is the language of the pictures and words, but pictures and words together. He said, which is the language of the emotional brain, which is actually very clever, isn't it? Which is true also. Like we said, the dreams, metaphors, pictures, will come into metaphor elicitation specifically later. But yeah, this is one of the things that exists inside this technique. What are the feelings associated with the brain? But then the most important part is the imprinting, and the imprinting is the memory regression. And the memory regression requires you to get people to relax a little bit. And basically, we regress them. They don't necessarily go to sleep, and it's not really a hypnotic exercise, but you get them into a situation where they might try and remember a very early memory of a brand, might try and remember a very important memory of a brand, a very strong memory of a brand, and maybe even a recent memory of a brand. He collected all of it. But he had a process. They went through all the things that the memories that people had written down, and they went through a process whereby they analyzed what was the one emotional code of this category, of this brand, whatever. And it was all about the challenge of getting it down to one or two words, getting the emotional code down in one or two words. And we did this once for something to do with oral hygiene, right? From memory. The code we had for oral hygiene, emotional code for oral hygiene, and we had a whole bunch of ways that we worked this out, was the emotional code of open. Open. There were a whole bunch of implications to that word, but the challenge was to get everything down to this one or two words for emotional coding. And there's a whole document about open, what that means. But that was the whole point. That was the code, and that was the challenge, and that's in fact what he did very well. Basically, memory regression. And when I say basically memory regression, there's nothing basic about it at all. What we did in order to get memory regression, we recruit people to come to a group room. We get them to take off their shoes. There would only be bean bags in the room. They would all sit on a bean bag, including myself, no shoes. And we would do the group on bean bags. And then a part of the group was dimming the lights, lying down, taking them through a memory regression exercise, getting them up and getting them to write it all down, basically in the group. So it was they were unusual groups and unusual groups, and the clients knew not to expect the usual chit chat and all that sort of stuff. They knew that's fine. And so we collected this information. Now, like I said, it's not basic. It's really hard to do because you've got to go through that entire rigmarole. And I've got to be honest, I didn't know any other researcher in this country who did it or was doing it except for me, because it was a way of getting to the consumer subconscious and got to some important outcomes for a whole bunch of clients. Now, I have to say, not every category lends itself as well to this sort of thing as others, but it can be done for every category. It's just that the outcome and the results are not equally potent for every category as well. So that is the emotional coding. That is another one of the ways that we get to the consumer subconscious, but now in the form of memories of old memories, of young memories, imprinted memories. So that's why they're so powerful. And then the other way, the other method that we use is it's called metaphor. It's the metaphor elicitation. We would shortcut this process in the back when we were still doing a lot of face-to-face groups in group rooms. We would shortcut that process, not taking time in the group, but getting people to do it at home, giving them a bit of extra money. They would bring in collage of a brand or a category with pictures and words. We will collect those. And in fact, in a number of times, those collages, which is basically metaphor elicitation, a number of times those collages gave us incredible information and incredible insight that really shaped the way that the brand was communicated quite strongly, right? Quite strongly. And I've got a number of examples. Unfortunately, I can't really go into them, even though they might be old, because they are commercial in confidence and they would still be relevant today for that category. So I do have to be a bit careful, but I can say that collage task that I used to have this as part of almost every single group would begin with people bringing in their collages. They introduce themselves, they introduce their collage. We already have a lot of metaphors about their relationship with the category or the brand in question at the beginning of the group, but not through what they're telling us through their visual representation that we asked them. So we went through a patch there for a number of years where every single group would give us, and we had stacks and stacks of these collages. They would be used, they would be part of the analysis. And that's ostensibly one of the best ways of metaphor elicitation, is giving people access to a whole bunch of images and so forth. Now, unfortunately, it's not unfortunate so much, but I guess in terms of people make images of the things that they have around them. There used to be magazines and that sort of thing, and then it went online. And when people started typing into Google search about something, a lot of the collages used to be similar because they would pick out the same first 10 pictures that came up on Google search about something. You see what I mean? So Google would help them a bit in that regard, but then things started to get a bit more samey and less creative. Therefore, we were getting less potent metaphor elicitation out of this. And now, of course, with an online group, it's hard, isn't it? Getting people to they're gonna do a Google search. They might even do an AI. They probably even put it into ChatGPT and it will suggest what images to put down for them. And it's just not going to be the same thing. Unfortunately, the whole thing about the metaphor elicitation qualitatively, where people go through this task of assembling pictures and often with very potent results, unfortunately, is a difficult one today because we have gone online. It really does require you to get back to that kind of face to face where people come to a room or people are prepared to do that little bit of homework, extra homework, and all that sort of thing. I think maybe those days are a little bit behind us. It's hard. You never say never, but that's a tough one, is what we're saying. It's very effective, but it is a tough one because it is a task that requires time and participation from the respondent. Like I said, Rapai used to do it as part of his group. He would allow half an hour inside a group for people. He would have a whole bunch of magazines and crap. And he would just allow half an hour for people to sit around and do it. We don't like to do that. That's a waste of time and money now to do that in groups. We've got other things to ask them, which is why we did it as homework, and it was effective as homework. But of course, everything has changed since then. And so therefore, that's a harder one to get. So things like, as is the emotional coding, as are the memories. However, there are different ways of getting memories. So here's the challenge. The challenge now is with things like projection actually still work online because of the nature of the stimulus and the nature of the responses that we get. Still works really well online because we supply the stimulus for the projection. We supply them the stimulus. Emotional coding is harder because you can't really regress people unless you've got access to them physically, and you can get them to lie down and you can get them to close their eyes and remember. That's harder, but it doesn't mean that people don't store memories anyway. You can get people to write early memories and stories of a brand. And I think it's a little surprising. People do remember stuff when you ask them to remember stuff. They don't all necessarily need to be semi-hypnotized. There are other ways to do it as well. But that is the challenge. The challenge now, and this is how we'll wrap this up. The challenge now is in the world of digital. The question is, how do we get these methodologies into our new digital realm? How do we get projection, metaphor elicitation? How do we get emotional coding into the new realm? We're not going to discuss that today. We've already gone long enough, but we just wanted to talk about the importance of this sort of thing, how it used to be done, how effective it was, how much of it we've done, of course. It's not just theoretical for us. It's a really practical issue for us. We've done thousands of interviews and groups doing this sort of stuff over our careers. And now the challenge is to bring this up to date, and we will actually address the methods that we are looking at for doing that in a future episode. And that's it. Thank you very much if you listened so far today, and we will be speaking again very soon. Goodbye.